To the rich man's bright lodges I ride in this wind. On my good horse I call you, my shiny black bess. To the playhouse of fortune, to take the bright silver and gold you have taken from somebody else.
You're tuned to WEOS Geneva and WXXE Fenner, Syracuse. This is Unwelcome Guests. I'm Lynn Gary. Counter-conventions, teach-ins, and other informational venues are an important part of the large protest mobilizations that have taken place during the past year in Seattle, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and last week in Los Angeles. Several alternative conventions were put on in Los Angeles during the Democratic Party convention. One of these was the People's Convention, a grassroots effort which didn't get much media coverage. Tonight we're going to present two panel discussions from the People's Convention. The first is on crack and the CIA, and deals with drug trafficking by the CIA and its connection to Wall Street and corporate finance. Then, fitting in the other piece of the puzzle, a panel on the prison industrial complex, where corporate interests double dip on the misery. First, they bring in the drugs and make a profit. Then they profit again, building prisons where drug offenders can be worked for slave wages.
BNZE-HD is a long-time activist in Los Angeles, especially in the black community, a well-known Pan-Africanist. Brother BNZE-HD, to lead this discussion on the issue of crack and the CIA. Brother BNZE-HD.
In Alaska, the Inuit, what they call the Eskimos, but native people, they call themselves Inuit, they have a practice where they'll take a knife and put it in the ice, and they'll put blood on the blade of the knife, have the handle in the ice and let it freeze up. And wolves, when they smell the blood, they come after the knife, and they start licking the knife because there's blood on it, because, you know, wolves like blood and raw meat. And as they lick the blade, it cuts their tongue. But they're in such a frenzy, you know, the endorphins kicking in the wolf's mind, they're in such a frenzy with the blood. They keep licking, cutting their tongue, cutting their mouth. They actually kill themselves in this frenzy over the knife that has the blood. The parallels being drawn to crack cocaine. I am a plaintiff. I used to use free base crack cocaine, especially in the 50s and 60s. It was an entertainment, upper middle class, white high, powder cocaine. You know, as it moved, films like Superfly in particular kind of introduced it culturally into the African community. And it was in the middle class in Baldwin Hills or Dara Heights that was using cocaine because it cost, at that time, $100 for a gram. With the gram you would get, put in a little bottle, mix it with baking soda, and heat it. And you would heat it until to separate the alkaloids and you get the little rock. Then you would smoke the rock. It was very expensive in those days. It was called freebasing. Okay? Because of the CIA, and these experts will talk about that, flooded the communities with cocaine, the cost went down from like $100 for a rock to $5 and $10 for a rock. It was really a genius marketing method, and I think Mike Rupert and Sully would talk about that. But it was actually the upper middle class European community, white community, and the upper middle class African community that made freebasing or smoking crack cocaine popular. Then it kind of went down in price, and it got spread from the upper class. Because many times what happens with the upper class is emulated or mimicked by the working class, by the unemployed as being trendy. Because if you ever smoke, those who have had experience with cocaine, I've never had experience with heroin or whatever, but as soon as you take one hit, you do whatever you can to get another hit, another hit, another hit, even though it's self-destructive. And I think we have seen, and I know we all have stories of people in our lives, of people we know, who self-destruct over something that the high is good for 2 or 3 minutes, but it destroys your lifestyle. So that was kind of like the message there, and I kind of bring that forward because there is a strong resistance movement, especially among young people, to what they saw their parents and the older generations went through with cocaine. And I kind of like to give a historical perspective to start off with. I have an article here from the Monthly Review, and this is a statement. It is by John Newsinger. It is a little known fact that during the reign of Queen Victoria in the 1830s, the British capitalist state, the British Empire, was the largest drug pusher the world has ever seen. The smuggling of opium into China was by the 1830s a source of huge profits. It played a critical role in the financing of British rule in India and was the underpinning of British trade throughout the East, as well as financed the British military expeditions throughout the world. This is one of those little historical facts that are often overlooked. And people remember Empress Dowager, how she was kind of portrayed as an evil, villainous woman. The reason why was she led the opium wars to throw the British opium dealers out of China. And one of the whole bases for the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong was the legacy of what imperialism had done to the people of China by mandating that opium be used by the people of China. So there's an historical precedent in drugs being used as chemical warfare, not only to downpress the people of an oppressed country, but also to maximize profits. Another article that comes from The Politics of Drugs, Who Suffers, Who Deals, Who Profits. After the inner city rebellions in the 1960s, and you know, when the Prince of Peace, Dr. Martin Luther King, crossed over to the ancestor world, 103 urban areas went up in rebellion as a testimonial to the lack of, for lack of a better word, the lack of success of his efforts through the nonviolent movement to bring equality, justice, and elimination of racism to African people in America. That sparked the rise of the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, and so many movements, because Dr. King died trying to bring justice and it failed. They said after the inner city rebellions in the 1960s, there was a tremendous increase of heroin and barbiturates flowing into the oppressed communities, which was of no concern to the Nixon administration until drug addiction started to spread into the white middle-class neighborhood. And any of you have read the biography of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, until his death, refused to acknowledge that there was a mafia in the United States, refused to acknowledge that organized crime, together with the CIA, was bringing drugs in the community. And the reason why is the mafia was white-mailing J. Edgar Hoover behind his transvestite homosexual practices. And they used that to shut him up. That's why the mafia was able, in conjunction with the CIA. And Alfred McCoy has a book called The Politics of Heroin. Excellent book, a PhD thesis that talks about the role of the CIA and the mafia, the deals that were made, where the mafia was giving green light to bring heroin in as long as the mafia would stop the organization of socialist and progressive trade unions along the coast in New York in particular. So there's a whole tradition here. I actually have a whole presentation to give, but we have such excellent speakers, I'm going to cut it short because time is short, okay? But what I'd like to do is hit a couple points. The number one, there's a historical legacy of drugs being used against people of color. And significantly, we have data here to show that there are more drug addicts, crack addicts in the European and white community than in the African community. Not in a ratio proportion, but overall in terms of gross number. So one of my concerns is that the media, in terms of psychological operations, has always portrayed crack equals black, black equals crack. If I say crack to you, you've been programmed subliminally and sublimely to think of a young brother. But objective statistics, empirical statistics from the FBI shows that there are more white crack users than black crack users, or African crack users. So this question of stopping the flow of drugs is not something that's just unique to the African community or to the Native American Latino community. It's something we all need to unite upon, though they're trying to portray it as a black thing so that the white middle class and working class and unemployed won't join us in forming movements to stop the flow of cocaine and to smash the CIA. It's a game, once again, to divide and conquer. Well, crack is a black thing, so white folks, y'all don't get involved with those kind of movements. So I want to put that out there. There's one point that's very important. Statistically, and it's really important because, there's a whole game of divide and conquer. And they play a lot of, things along that line. Statistically, we know first-time offenders charged with the same crime, young African youth, are 6 times more likely to be locked up as white youth. 6 times more likely. Though whites and blacks use drugs at the same rate, nearly 2/3 of those convicted are black. We use drugs at the same rate, but 2/3 of those convicted are black. Between 1985 and 1995, the rate of Latino, Native American incarceration nationwide more than tripled. Latinos are the largest growing group of imprisoned so-called American citizens today. It's another phenomenon that the media doesn't address. They always talk about black. But our Native American or Latino brothers and sisters are the fastest growing incarceration rates. So these are the kind of things we need to put out there boldly to combat the media distortions of the facts so we can form the kind of alliance and coalitions to roll back the CIA and the drugs coming in our community. Though in California, Africans are 7% of the population, we make up 38% of all those sent to adult prisons. A lot of statistics like this are available. We can make them available to you. In terms of the media, if you ever notice, and we've been doing some studies and observation, that in terms of popular television and in terms of popular films, there's always a glorification of the drug dealer. Yet the media, especially films that are geared to the African and to the youth community, never really focus on the drug user or the drug addict. And so many films about South Central, Boys in the Hood, New Jack City, and so forth, they're always glamorizing the dope dealer, the drug dealer, the cars, the ladies, the posses, the weapons, the respect. But there are very few drama films, of the Ice Cube or the Hudson Brothers character that talks about the damage it does to the drug addict. And we see this as part of an actual conspiracy coming out of Hollywood, as part and parcel of the prison industrial complex that wants to encourage our young people to be involved with the drug trade. Groups like Public Enemy, Dead Prez, KRS can never get radio play on primetime KBET or on KPWR, which are the primary hip-hop stations. But artists that promote drug use get played all the time on local radio in Los Angeles. Why is it that conscious artists can't get prime airtime because their music is too ethnic or too rebellious or too angry, but those talking about slinging drugs, banging, women or B's and H get prime time radio play on the Beat and on Power. Even the assault on the Rastafarian movement, the assault where in Los Angeles, it's easier to find a rock than a marijuana joint. You go to Venice Beach right now, and you go down on Broadway, San Juan, go on Ocean Walk, I can find, cocaine, rocks all day long. You try to find a marijuana cigarette, you can't find a joint. And I've never heard of anybody dying from smoking a joint. Maybe I'm wrong, but I've never heard of nobody dying from smoking a joint. And I believe in the legalization of marijuana, by the way, obviously. So you want to make that point also. A number of studies have been done that talk about how even within, and actually a study was done by University of Washington sociologists that found a consistent bias by probation officers in their written report on young black and white offenders. And they actually did control experiments. They got two kids, one African, one European, from the same background, same offense, same age, no prior convictions. Black kids were described routinely as having bad character flaws, a bad attitude, bad mannerism, incorrigible, while the white kids were portrayed as victims of negative environment, exposure to some family conflicts, or being around bad company. We can look at Columbine, the Columbine massacre that occurred in Littleton, in Colorado. They talked about, to rationalize the children committing the massacre, they talked about what they call the nerd factor, the jock factor. They watched too many video games. They were alienated. Their parents did not give them love. So somehow or other, when European youth are in the probation or in the judicial system, they come up with sociological reasons to rationale, to give them probation, they give them psychological therapy. Whereas when it comes to African youth with the same identical backgrounds, they're incorrigible. When you say incorrigible, what are you saying? There's no hope for them. You got to lock them down because they cannot be rehabilitated. No matter what kind of psychological training or therapy they receive, they cannot be affected. So these are some of the examples just of racism within the question of cocaine and prosecution. And of course we can talk about the prison industrial complex, the California Correction Officers Union, which is the major contributor to the governor's election, which is the largest lobbying organization in the United States today. Also in the stock market, the fastest growth stock industry has to do with securities. And the statistic shows that for every one inmate put into prison, the cost of building that prison for one inmate is $145,000 per inmate, and then $32,000 per year to sustain that inmate. That means from our tax dollars, $145,000 is coming from our pockets and going into the hands of private corporations, multinational corporations, to build the institution And $32,000 per year comes out of our tax dollars to go and basically provide services to the inmate: food, clothing, shelter, telephones, etc., etc., etc. So basically, we're talking about $170,000 first swap and $32,000 the second year and beyond coming out of our tax dollars going into the prison industrial complex, making the rich richer, while programs like education, music programs, sports programs in our communities are radically declining. In terms of solutions, we say power begins with conception, and I'll probably end this presentation giving some ideas we've put together collectively as Crack the CIA Coalition. I also maybe like to start and just state the demands of the coalition. The coalition's been around about 6 years. We have a number of people in the room, Donna, just a lot of activists in the room that have worked with the coalition, Maria, Brother Rudy, who have worked with the coalition. But our demands are very simple. Number one, we demand full disclosure of the CIA of all activities involved with drugs. Number two, we demand a full dismantling of the CIA. Number three, community control of all drug rehab programs. We want the community to control it as opposed to private sector corporations and bureaucracies. We want reparations to the affected communities. We want the repeal of mandatory minimum sentencing. We want to end the sentence disparity between powder and crack cocaine. We want to end the phony drug war that has the United States deeply involved. I'm sure Mike was going to mention it. The United States deep involved in Colombia today under the pretext of the so-called drug war. We want full support for the gang truce because we understand that the rise and the militarization and the violence of the gangs can be directly attributed to the CIA bringing drugs into South Central, providing easy access to weapons, as well as the runaway employers like Goodyear and Firestone, creating massive unemployment, and the cocaine coming in being, in fact, the employer of the unemployed because of the lack of full employment in our communities. And we want to end the media cover, especially LA Times, Washington Times, and New York Times, on constantly evolving and breaking stories, constantly documenting the role of the CIA and bringing drugs in our community. So that's kind of like a little overview of where we stand as the Crack the CIA Coalition. And I would like, at this point now, to bring up Mike Rupert, who I've spoken with on many programs throughout the country. I come from a Black Panther Party tradition, and I always say this, and Mike gets upset, but I got to say this all the time because I got to make it very clear that I have no respect for any police or pigs, as we call them. But Mike has turned his energy against the police department, against the CIA, and has joined humanity in terms of providing research, facts, and helping us organize a movement against the CIA. So this is one of the few pigs or ex-pigs that have the highest respect for it. And Mike is just very, very consistent, very, very militant about his information about the cause.
Thank you, Didon. Just shout out your answers. Somebody name for me the 4 states in the United States that are responsible for most of the importation of illegal drugs. Through what 4 states do they come? Texas, Florida, California, New York. Texas, California, Florida, and New York. DEA, Department of Justice, estimate that around 70+% of all illegal smuggled drugs come in through those 4 states. $250 billion, $250 billion every year. This is from University of Ottawa Economics Department, my research, a lot of other good research, is laundered through the American economy, meaning that drug money is moved through American financial institutions, businesses, stock purchases, to make that money legal and usable. Through what 4 states is most of that $250 billion laundered? Go ahead, shout it out. California, Texas, New York, Florida, the same 4 states. From what 4 states do 80% of all presidential campaign contributions come? Texas, California, Florida, and New York. Who governs Texas and Florida? The Bushes. Why does Hillary want New York? Could it be? These are some of the things that we begin to put in perspective when I begin to tell you a little bit about how the hows and the whys that the Central Intelligence Agency has been dealing drugs for more than 50 years, since even before it was the CIA. Now let me tell you something about the Central Intelligence Agency. The man who wrote the National Security Act of 1947 that created the CIA, his name was Clark Clifford, Who can tell me what Clark Clifford did for a living? He was a banker, Wall Street banker and a lawyer. He brought us BCCI, the drug bank that bought American banks in the 1990s. He wrote the Act in 47 creating CIA. Now, who designed the CIA and told Clark Clifford how to write the Act? It was two guys named John Foster and Allen Dulles. What did they do for a living? They were lawyers in the Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, the largest law firm on Wall Street. William Casey, who was Ronald Reagan's director of Central Intelligence, what did he do for a living? He was a lawyer, and he was a stockbroker, and under Richard Nixon, he was chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The CIA is an agency that has, for its entire existence, acted for and on behalf of Wall Street. When you begin to comprehend that, you begin to understand why, out of $500 billion a year, as Le Monde, the wonderful publication from Paris, puts it so eloquently, we have evolved into a situation where the wars of this century will be for the control of illegal money. Who can control the profits of $1 trillion crime industry and $500 billion a year in illegal drug money? There are a great many ways I can explain that to you. Now let me say, while I have your attention, that I'm the publisher and editor of From the Wilderness. It's a newsletter we have at the back table. We're now read by 12 members of Congress. We just picked up Slade Gorton and Patrick Leahy, who are both opponents of U.S. involvement in Colombia, the intelligence committees of both houses, and professors at 10 universities. We also have a fabulous book up there at the table from a very dear friend of mine, Celerino Castillo, a true American hero, who stood at Ilopango Airfield in El Salvador and watched CIA personnel orchestrate plane loads of cocaine flying into the U.S., personally confronted George Bush, only to be told, leave it alone, it's a White House operation. There are only a few copies of Sully's book, and we have them back at the table, and they're autographed. I encourage you to support him, because half of every sale goes directly to keep him in house and home. Now that I've done the commercial, I love you too. I want to talk a little bit about the economy, because when you understand the role of CIA in drugs and why it happens, you will begin to understand how the whole system fits together. I shared in a panel earlier today. Now, this is very hard to see, but we don't have an overhead. But if I were to tell you, and almost everybody here is from LA, that this is the Santa Monica Freeway right here, and this is the Harbor Freeway right here, you would say that this mass of black dots is South Central Los Angeles. Wouldn't you agree with me that that's South Central Los Angeles? Now, what if I told you that this map, prepared by a former Assistant Secretary of Housing, each one of those dots represents the foreclosure of a single-family home loan in South Central Los Angeles that defaulted between 1982 and 1990. There were many casualties of the crack cocaine epidemic, but economically speaking, the rich people have always had an idea that it's always better to use the poor people's money to vanquish them than spend their own. So they could bring the cocaine into Los Angeles and take all the money from the sales of cocaine, drive the property values down to the point where people who had $120,000 mortgages could no longer keep the payments because the neighborhood had turned into a war zone. The children were in jail, dead, or in the hospital, and they couldn't sell the house for what they owed on it, so they walked away. And years later, some other investors, namely a lot of white-owned, but there were many other, some black-owned, and some Latin-owned and Oriental-owned mortgage companies came and bought these houses in groups of 10, 15, and 20 for 20 and 30 cents on the dollar. Okay, this is an economy that makes profits on everything, but it's called a search and destroy, is what I call it, a search and destroy economy. Okay, these were single-family home loans, private companies. Who knows? I don't know. I do know, but it would take me an hour to answer the question. What I'm saying is they were all private investors who were heavy political campaign donors who kicked the money back to the politicians who kept the whole thing going. Now, they won't tell you that. Now, I caught CIA. I became a witness to CIA dealing drugs more than 24 years ago. I come from a CIA family. I worked for LAPD. I didn't discover this because I was an LA cop. It's not something every LA cop knows. It happened because I come from a CIA family, and my mother was a cryptographer for the Tehran conference in 1943 with Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, I was being groomed to be a CIA agent or officer within LAPD. Now, I never worked for the agency, but I met a lot of agency people inside LAPD who carried badges and guns, but they were CIA more than they were LAPD cops. And that's the way the agency protects its drug trafficking. Okay? Now, I was forced out of LAPD in 1978, years before the Contras, but I had seen it firsthand, and I was shot at, and I won't bore you with all the details. They weren't boring at the time, but I won't go through that now. What I'm saying is that there's a great many of us who know. There are people in a court of law, eyewitnesses. The first thing a DA asks for, did anybody witness the crime? Well, I'm an eyewitness to CIA dealing drugs, and so is Selly. We're the first people you would want to talk to, but we've been ignored. But I want to talk about an issue of proof. People say there's no proof. And I'm going to tell you right now, we have so much proof that before a jury of any rational men and women anywhere in this country, we could prove right now that the CIA is criminally complicit in the drug trade. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about that. You all remember the Gary Webb stories from 1996 about Freeway Ricky Ross, the Dark Alliance series, which brought CIA Director John Deutsch to Locke High School so I could beat up on him for a little while. That was fun. And the big investigations that came as a result of that. That's Gary Webb's fabulous book, Dark Alliance, which goes further than any other toward really documenting direct CIA involvement. Well, a number of investigations were started as a result of that, and as a result of my confrontation with John Deutsch. Now, these are excerpts which I publish, but the report from which these excerpts come is a CIA report. And I have a huge website, and those of you who want to write it down, it's www.copvcia.com, copvcia.com. And you can link directly to the CIA report, which is about 460 pages. But I have pulled these 60 pages out of that report, and I've made my editorial comments, but these are the CIA's own words. In their report, which was released on October the 8th of 1998, the CIA admits that throughout the course of the Contra War, it dealt with 58 known narcotics traffickers. It admits that it kept 6 of them out of jail. It admits that it deliberately lied to the United States Congress about the role of drug trafficking played by its assets and employees during the Contra War. It admits that it briefed Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush on how it was lying to Congress about trafficking by its agents and employees and assets on a regular basis, and that Vice President Bush approved. It admits page after page after page, but let me just read you one little example, okay, when we talk about proof. Paragraph 490, and I've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. How am I doing on time, all right? Paragraph 490 talks about a guy named Moises Nunez, okay? He was a CIA contractor in essence. He was on a State Department subsidy. The poor guy wasn't making enough moving 200 kilos of cocaine a week, so the State Department had to give him a little extra to supply humanitarian aid to the Contras. And he was caught with 200 kilos of cocaine and taken into custody, and the CIA talked to him, and they wrote here, he says that Nunez revealed that since 1985 he had engaged in a clandestine relationship with the National Security Council. That's the White House that oversees the CIA. That's Oliver North, okay? He had engaged in a clandestine relationship with the National Security Council. Nunez refused to elaborate on the nature of these actions, but indicated it was difficult to answer questions relating to his involvement in narcotics trafficking because of the specific tasks he had performed at the direction of the NSC. In other words, he's dealing the cocaine for the White House. It's right here, CIA's own report. Okay? In the next paragraph, CIA says, well, we didn't know what to do with this guy, but it says, the next day, however, a headquarters cable stated that headquarters had decided against debriefing Nunez. Don't ask him any more questions. Direct cable from CIA to the field. Page after page. A company called Setco, moving 4 tons of cocaine a month, owned by Juan Ramon Mara Ballesteros in Honduras, was using bank accounts that were opened by Oliver North. It's right here in the CIA's report. Now let me read you the most stunning part of this. This is the actual letter. It's a memorandum. In 1981, Ronald Reagan's Director of Central Intelligence and the U.S. Department of Justice began a series of negotiations because it's a law under U.S. code that a government agency must report crimes by its employees. But yet they started a whole new series of negotiations under Reagan, and they suddenly took, at CIA, the highest food level on the food chain is a case officer. That's a card-carrying, badge-carrying CIA guy who can't be disavowed if he's caught or captured. Beneath that, they have career agents, they have contract agents, they have informants, they have contract employees, they have all these other things. And they entered into this negotiations, and they suddenly said everybody who's not a case officer at CIA is no longer an employee under the law. These are people who were going to get pensions from CIA. Let me read you this letter dated, just one paragraph, dated February 11th, 1982. It's addressed to the Honorable William J. Casey, Director of Central Intelligence, signed by William French Smith, Ronald Reagan's Attorney General. It says, in light of these provisions and in view of the fine cooperation the Drug Enforcement Administration, Shelley may comment on that, has received from CIA, no formal requirement regarding the reporting of narcotics violations has been included in these procedures. By the stroke of a pen, this is the smoking gun document, the U.S. Department of Justice told the CIA that there was no need to report drug trafficking by its employees. Now, if I say to you that we have a criminal government, maybe I will make some sense to you. I hope so. It's clear. It's as clear as the nose on my face. It's as clear as the nose on everybody's face right here, okay? We have a criminal government that is engaged in criminal activity. So why do we question why do we act sometimes as if we're dealing with someone that has perfect legitimacy? But we have to work within the system. We have now enough evidence, and I think Bill will probably agree with me, he's a good lawyer, we could put the CIA on trial right now and convict them beyond a shadow of a doubt. I would like to take it to a jury, and I think you would too. Okay, but even more so, the United States Congress in May of this year, after 4 years of stalling, after they sent investigators from the House Intelligence Committee to copy 6,000 pages of my records, said, we've looked at all the evidence, including what I just read you, and said there's no evidence that CIA had anything to do with drugs, case closed. That's the House Intelligence Committee. They read what I just read you and hundreds and thousands of pages more and said there's nothing wrong here. And yet, just 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that's one level below the Supreme Court, in hearing the case of a Contra leader, Renato Peña, who was fighting extradition, said, we've read these same documents, and Mr. Peña is making a claim that the CIA sanctioned his drug trafficking, and we think he's right. He needs an evidentiary hearing. So that's pending, but our case just got very strong. Stronger. Now, I want to show you a couple more things before I turn this over to Bill. I've been at this for 22 years, and I have collected lots of documents. And again, my website is huge, and if you're interested, please go visit us on the web. If you want current stuff that's really hot and new, please subscribe to From the Wilderness, because the subscribers get the stuff that's new. I have to toot my own horn. Is that okay? He says he does it all the time anyway. If you can see the headline on this story, it's called The Democratic Party Presidential Drug Money Pipeline. I wrote this in the April issue of From the Wilderness. It has been nominated for a $20,000 prize at the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, D.C. In this article, I document how Charles Manat, the former Democratic National Committee chairman, with Tony Coelho, has established a drug money pipeline going directly into the Gore presidential campaign. And it was done through the Dominican Republic, where Charles Manat is now the U.S. ambassador to the Dominican Republic, which is a backwater posting for anybody in the State Department. And in fact, no political appointee has ever taken the position as ambassador to the Dominican Republic since 1957. Yet just last December, Charles Manat, one of the most powerful lawyers in the world, a former DNC chair, voluntarily became ambassador to the Dominican Republic. And then I produced a sensitive, classified intelligence report out of the Department of Justice saying that 1/3 of all the cocaine entering the U.S. passes through the Dominican Republic. They don't tell you that in the major media, do they? Then I documented how Coelho and Manat had in the 80s been tied to a drug smuggler named Barry Seal. And I also tied in this article the fact that the Dominican Revolutionary Party, which is headquartered, of course, in the Dominican Republic in Washington Heights of New York City, had made direct cash contributions to Al Gore in 1996. If you don't play with drug money in this economy, you can't play at all. And until you understand that, you don't understand how it all works. And that's why I say over and over again, the way to pull the plug on the whole rotten system is to decriminalize. It worked with Al Capone, didn't it? It put the bootleggers out of business, didn't it? Why are we so afraid to touch that subject now? Well, I'm going to shut up in a second, and in a second I'm going to invite Dion up. I just want to say that I took this evidence right here, and I said in 1998, we don't need anything else other than what's in this report to sue the government. And maybe Bill Simpich will tell us a little bit about what happened next. Thank you.
You get a round of applause. Just a couple of points right quick. One, Mike Rupert is constantly living hand to mouth. And the reason why he's so committed to this cause, that many times we ask him to come to speak to different communities, like the Nation of Islam's mosque, or we ask him to come to speak to the students at Santa Monica College or Cal Berkeley. Even when they have no money, he will come and give this information, come out of his own pocket to get there. And that's commitment. So I'd like to give a round of applause to a real warrior for this cause. Also, the struggle against the CIA and drugs is not a new struggle. We can go back to the 1930s with the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, who, if you remember any of Malcolm's speeches, talked about the role of the government bringing heroin into Harlem, because how many black people have planes and have contacts in Burma, Laos, and these kind of areas. We can look at the Black Panther Party. We can look at SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, under Marion Barry, under Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, who constantly put out educational materials about how the drugs got into our communities. We can look at the Black Panther Party and brochures being put out on how do drugs get in our community. We can look at the Critics Institute in 1984. That was a vanguard organization that brought to our consciousness the role of the CIA bringing drugs in our community. We can look to the Crack the CIA Code. So there's a whole history of struggle to bring to the forefront the question of CIA and drugs. And I like to say that the CIA is like roaches, and I don't know how many people have roaches in their homes, but if you got roaches in their home, if you put a light on them at night, they scurry away. And because of the excellent work of the panelists and of these mass movements, like the Nation of Islam, like the Black Panther Party, like the Critics Institute, like Students for a Democratic Society, and today because of the Crack the CIA Coalition, among other groups, that we find the quantity and quality of cocaine in our community radically declining compared to what it was like from 1982 to 1994. So we, the progressive community, should take responsibility and take pride in the victory and rolling back the cocaine epidemic in third world communities. Because it wasn't the government that stopped the flow of cocaine in our community. It was the mass protests and the educational campaigns and the works of people on this panel that rolled back the epidemic, that terrorized our community and many communities from 1982 to 1994. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Bill Sippage. He does this work pro bono. He leads the legal team of Commissari, Furwich, and Sippage that has taken on the task of utilizing the legal system to indict the CIA and to get reparations through a class action lawsuit. And lawyers tend to be very conservative a lot. And when you go as a legal firm, a small legal firm against the mighty CIA, that's the spirit of Malcolm X. That's the spirit of Cesar Chavez. So as a lawyer taking that kind of stand, I've got the highest respect because, they're in the bullseye, the crosshairs of the CIA right now. So can we give a round of applause to Bill Sippage and the excellent work he's doing?
Thank you, Didon. And Mike stole my line because we're in a time where we've got to move into an investigation-free zone. The investigation, in other words, has been done. Didon laid it out, Mike laid it out, and Sally's going to lay it out. So I'm only going to focus on a couple pieces of evidence, and I'm going to urge that people read some of these books if they haven't read them already, but don't go out there feeling like there's more that needs to be uncovered. What the difference is, in short, we need to take action. We need to take serious, fundamental mass action. And that action has to focus on many issues, but one of them has got to be ending the drug war. And to end the drug war, a fundamental piece of it has got to be to focus that light, that spotlight, on the CIA and these other intelligence agencies that are running their schemes around the world and say very clearly, no more, not in our name. Because reading is important and research is important. I don't want to denigrate those things, but they can't be a substitute for action. And we on the legal team and those of us who are plaintiffs, like Donna Warren, who is the lead plaintiff in the case and has put in many, many, many hours of her own without pay. None of us can do the work effectively if there aren't people pushing the system on a daily basis. In the schools, in their communities, at their labor unions, this issue has to be raised over and over again until the paranoia goes away. In our suit, what we say is that in 1982 there was a written agreement between the Attorney General, William French Smith, and the CIA chief, Bill Casey. And what they did was they redefined what an employee was. They said that if you are a pilot or a contractor or an informant for the CIA, you're not an employee. That was an important distinction because all through the Cold War, up till Watergate, CIA employees had regularly been engaged in the drug trade, gotten caught, referred to the, and yet there was no reference to these cases to the Department of Justice for prosecution. And the reason was because there was a kind of a handshake agreement for 22 years between 54 and 76 where they didn't have a duty to refer it to the Justice Department. Unfortunately, that violated the law. There was a committee that said this is basically, a conspiracy to violate the laws involving all federal employees. You've got to stop it. So for 6 years, they did the okey doke and pretended to follow it. And then in 82, they said, we know a way around it. And the way around it was this redefinition of employees I've just mentioned. And why did they have to redefine what an employee was? It was because the Reagan administration was in the saddle, and there was a region to invade, and that region was Central America. Just like in the past, there was a region to invade called Vietnam. And during that era, the opium came down to the hills, and the heroin labs were sprouting all throughout that sector of the world. And the heroin came back on the plains with the bodies of the soldiers and played a key role in enslaving African American and other communities, primarily poor communities. And just like what the Brits did in China in the 19th century in the Opium Wars, where they had a product and they needed to get rid of it, and they did it to the people of China. It's an old story. It's a nasty story. And the difference is, it's done for world domination in terms of power and money. And the reason it's done is because the big dope dealers are where the money is, where the influence is. And their influence controls the foreign policy of that region. And the CIA needs to curry favor with the powers of that region. And they play the role of the puppet master. I always say, and I mean it, I don't really care whether the CIA has its hands in the cocaine or not. Because what they do is a functional equivalent. They fold their arms, they look the other way, and it gets through unimpeded, and the people who are doing it effectively have protection by this sin of omission. So they can say their hands are clean, and yet, as a matter of policy, what they've done is create a situation in 1982 where they knew that tons and tons of cocaine was going to enter unimpeded into the United States. And that the demand side, which is the United States and Western Europe, was going to expand like nobody's business. And as a result, the price was going to plummet, and whole new sectors of the population were going to be enslaved. It's an old story. It's not a pretty story. The saddest part of this story, in a sense, is that they've admitted it. The agreement is there on the web. All you have to do is go to the CIA's own website at odci.org, and then you go into the publications sub-index. You look for the Contra story. It was released October 1998 by Inspector Frederick Hitz, and there it is. In paragraph 115, they say, "Oh, we don't care about, ordinary narcotics trafficking. What we focus on is strategic narcotics trafficking, the kind of narcotics trafficking that affects the rise and fall of entire economies and governments." That's a paraphrase of their very words in the document. And this document also spells out exactly, with painful efficiency, just how this agreement was created, all the lawyers that were involved, all the people who looked the other way, all the people who clucked their tongues and did nothing. And that's paragraph 54. It's all right there. And unfortunately, This is the kind of issue that it's difficult to get traction on. And I think the reason why is because so many of us have felt like it's going to be very difficult to get the snowball down the hill and build up a wide constituency that's able to deal with these issues without paranoia, without fear, without calls for another 10 years of investigation. In other words, a constituency that's informed and ready for action. And so frankly, that's where people like Celly come in, Celly Castillo. That's where people like Donna Warren come in. People who have been out there fighting the fight one day at a time, going to audiences one day at a time, and building that base of a new community that is willing to move forward despite fear, despite the paranoia, despite the fear of being mocked, despite the fear of being laughed at, and saying, look, our 2 million brothers and sisters in jail is very, very important. But this is going to happen again and again and again until we take fundamental action against these intelligence agencies. And the final piece is that we've got a class action suit going. And we'll be filing more suits similar to the tobacco suits, where we're going to be saying cocaine is like a contraband substance, given the blind eye and the okay by the USA, and the government has to pay for all these illnesses and disease, just like the tobacco. But we're not the only class action lawsuit in town. There's the DEA, if you can believe it, filed its own class action against the CIA for its actions in Burma and its actions in Guatemala. Celly's been involved in that case. And the reason is the same. The DEA can't even make the busts because the CIA is hiding the identity of the traffickers or giving them the tip-off at appropriate times. So Celly's the man who was there on the ground at Ilopango when they were bringing the cocaine by American planes in the 1980s. And it's people like Celly coming forward, and people like Donna Warren, who lost a son to this madness, has been fighting to stop it, that can help bring this thing to closure. Thank you.
Once again, we'd like to acknowledge Bill Sippage. Lawyers, by definition, are very conservative, within the system legalist, and to take a stand against the CIA, as we saw what happened at Christie's Institute, who took a stand against the CIA, and in fact were sued out of existence by, I think it was the 7th District Federal Court that went against them for so-called filing a frivolous lawsuit against the CIA. So he's putting his career and his law firm on the line, taking a stand against the CIA. I think it's also important not just talk about the victories in terms of rolling back cocaine by putting a highlight, an emphasis, magnifying the CIA's role in bringing cocaine into the United States, but also for us to forecast. Basically, we're in a defensive or we're in a reactive mode. We're reacting to the cocaine epidemic that occurred from 1982 to 1994 through the exposés, through many books written on this topic and so forth. But, capitalism never sleeps. Both on the legal oppression of humanity and the illegal oppression of humanity, they continually work 24/7 to maximize profits, both legally and illegally. And so many of us are concerned with trying to forecast. Now we understand the nature of this beast, the nature of the CIA, to forecast what is their next move. Because I think it's very important to be proactive, not just reactive. And if you monitor popular literature, whether it's in Madison Avenue in terms of public relations and the whole image industry, you find that the so-called heroin look among models, the real kind of, when I was younger, there's a thing called the Twiggy look, the real skinny, gaunt, blonde hair, blue eyed, but they got the same physical feature, but now it's got they call the heroin look. Dark eyes, gaunt face, looking like a heroin addict. That's considered trendy now. If you look in terms of the music industry, the use of heroin is being glamorified by heavy metal, rock, and people that are involved with what they call hate or race music. That's very trendy. If you look, for instance, at some of the statistics coming from the San Francisco General Hospital, there's been a radical increase in white upper-class youth being admitted for heroin overdose. What has occurred is that the marijuana fields in Mexico have been plowed under, and they've been replanted with poppy fields, so that the issue of moving heroin from Southeast Asia all the way to the United States is now not a major issue, because now you're getting pure heroin coming from Mexico into the United States. And among white upper middle class youth in Texas, in Arizona, and Colorado, that's the drug of choice. And all of us have been socialized not to put a needle in your arm because of the spread of AIDS and a whole kind of derelict look. But the heroin is so pure that it's what they call smokable heroin. And that's the most dangerous. And most of us have been raised, I know I've been raised to smoke anything. I'll smoke a cigarette, smoke a joint, whatever, because the whole cigarette smoking is cool. Putting a needle in your arm is negative. So what they've done is come up with a pure form of heroin, Mexican mud, is really big, especially among white upper middle class youth. But as with cocaine, it started with the rock entertainers in Hollywood. It filtered down as they became more marketing savvy and made it much cheaper per unit until it became a mass phenomenon among the African communities, the Native American communities, and the European communities. So it's very important for us to learn from the analysis being provided by these experts on what occurred with the cocaine epidemic to prepare ourselves for the heroin onslaught that's predicted for the year 2000 and onward with the growing of poppy fields in Mexico. So we'd like to bring up a comrade, a Latino brother, who's many times played different roles as an Italian, when he worked for DEA, as an undercover agent infiltrating the New York Mafia, also going into Central America to try to stop the flow of drugs. And his revelations and experiences in Central America taught him, which he wrote into a book called Powder Burns. The United States is not only not serious about stopping the flow of drugs into the United States, but actually is involved with bringing C-40 cargo planes of cocaine into the United States. And he'll talk about that. Cidanio Castillo. Can we give him a round of applause?
Well, I don't know where to start. I usually lecture for about an hour and a half, and I have a slideshow presentation and nice pictures and the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I'll try my best to try to touch up on what Mike and Bill said and did Don about the drugs. I go back. I'm a Latino Chicano out of South Texas, and my first experience was in Vietnam. That's for the first time I saw a lot of my fellow soldiers lie low on drug addiction. A lot of them died. 1/3 of all the soldiers that came back from Vietnam were heroin addicts. 1 out of 3. 58,000. We lost 58,000 soldiers in Vietnam. When I went to the wall in '84 for the first time, to the Vietnam Memorial Wall, there were 58,000 names or so. And did you know that you can build 2 more walls of the people that came back and died? A lot of them died from suicide. They could not adjust to the world again. A lot of them suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is known. They all died. And they were on borrowed time, as they say, like most junkies that we have in this country now. That was the first time I saw what drugs would do to a human being. And I remember there were times where I would find my body, a friend of mine laying down with a needle stuck in his arm in the boonies. So instead of letting him go home, reported as a junkie, I would have to shoot him in the chest twice with an AK-47 to say that he died a good hero. But those are the things that I saw. And I swore to God, I said, God help me. If I make it back from that war, I am going to be a federal narcotics agent and continue this war against the drug traffickers. But it was also there in Vietnam that I saw that the CIA was involved in smuggling heroin in body bags into the U.S. So see, the CIA has a history going back a long time where they've been involved in drug trafficking. We saw it in Afghanistan. We saw it in Salvador. We saw it in Mexico, and we're seeing it now in Colombia. So you see, it's not the first time. Now, let me tell you, I have a lot, talking about discrimination, talking about a little bit of everything, how the CIA works. I'm from South Texas. I was a police officer and a detective for 6 years before I went to the federal government. So my first assignment, being a Chicano from South Texas, where do you think they sent me? You can make it. You made it. You're going to New York City. As D-Don was saying, I walked in the New York DEA office, and there it was. I walked in with a cowboy hat and cowboy boots. But as they say, if you made it in New York, you can make it anywhere. From there, I went down to Central America, where I worked hand in hand with the worst human rights violators in the face of the earth that were trained by the CIA. I worked in El Salvador with the death squads that were supported by the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. government. A while ago, I came in and I talked to Maria. She's a Salvadorian over here. She was captured by the death squads. Luckily enough, she was able to make it and tell her story now. But the Central Intelligence Agency have strongly been involved in drug trafficking for many years. Not only that, they've been involved in money laundering and murder with relative at ease. Okay, Bill is saying over here that he's got the evidence. I just responded to the House Select Committee on Intelligence. I got a 24-page report. And the reason I was able to do this report because I kept journals. I got over 2,000 pictures. At the end of the day, I would go home and I would write down on my journal what happened. Right now, I can prove that the CIA was involved in 13 overt acts on drug trafficking that I witnessed, that I documented, that I took pictures of. I have them on 3 counts of murder. People that they killed. Now, I'm not talking about CIA assets. I am talking about CIA officials. That's why they never wanted me to go before the committee. And they contacted me and said, Cele, we want to interview you. I said, sure, but let me record the interview. Because that's the only way I'm going to be able to prove what I did say or I did not say. And they wouldn't allow that. So I was not interviewed by them. But if I had, I could very well prove that the Central Intelligence Agency is responsible for all the crack epidemics that we had in the 80s. I knew all the CIA agents that were down there flying. All the Contra assets that worked for the CIA were all documented in DEA files as drug traffickers. Yet the CIA was giving them U.S. visas to fly to the U.S. with drugs. Now, their mentality is very simple. Cele, what do you think you're doing reporting this to Washington, that we're involved in drug trafficking and our people are involved? Hey, we own these countries. In El Salvador, they paid $1.5 million a day for the past 10 years to fight that war. They could have won that war a long time ago. But this is their mentality. We were building what was known as cocaine democracies. We were letting countries like El Salvador, the President Duarte and his son were heavily involved in drug trafficking. But it was okay. You know why? Because it was a democracy. Guatemala, the same thing. We had Benicio Cerezo and his family heavily documented in DEA files as drug traffickers. But it was okay again. Why? Because it was a cocaine democracy. So I just let you go and let you know that I will help Bill, whether I'll be a participant or an expert witness, on the fact of what I know of what the CIA has been involved in drug trafficking. And like I said, this is going to be up. This is up, Mike, if I'm not mistaken, in your website. You can go up there and see it. And it's my response to the House Select Committee that just came out. I just did this. I just finished this 2 weeks ago. And what I did is I went back to my journals and got everything out that the CIA was involved in. And you know what? The difference between this and any other document that's out there, I have names of CIA officials that were involved in this atrocity. I have pictures of people that were tortured and murdered by the CIA in Central America. The new law went into effect. They said, if anybody shows a picture of a CIA official, you automatically get 5 years in prison. And I really don't care, because we tried it every other way. So now the pictures will be up, and you will see for the first time faces of CIA officials that were involved in these atrocities. Thank you.
WEOS Geneva, WXXE Fenner, Syracuse.